Um, This is the last evening in this temple for this visit, but I'm sure I will be back before too much time has passed. It's been way too much fun. So even though I know once I get back to California, that will become real to me again. Right now it's just sort of a shadowy memory back there of the life I've been living for a quarter of a century, including a husband. But I'm sure that when I'm there again, it will all seem very real. So I can't say what's going to happen, but I'm sure I'll be back. I hope to have a chance to ask Swami Kriyananda for a little bit of advice when I see him next week, but even if I can't do that, I'm sure I'll be able to know. And I think visiting India will just be a regular part of my life in this form, coming to speak and share with all of you. I would miss you too much, so I have to come back. This particular book, Miracles and Answered Prayers, just to share a little bit about how it came to be. I have no idea why it occurred to Swami Kriyananda to write it, but it did, and he just sent word out to a number of us, actually a very wide circle, that he was wanting to write a book about the people's experiences, and please send him your experiences. And then about 6 months later, when he came to visit our house on his way to or from some other continent, he just called me in and said, I don't really feel like writing it. And then he handed me the stack of stories insofar as he had gathered them. Here, you do it, just like that. He did it for some personal reasons, well, a number of personal reasons for me, but he's always wanted me to do more writing. And in fact, back in my early 20s, he actually just tried to start me out as a writer. I had karmic issues with being able to write, and I just wasn't able to do it. And so he said, well, you're comfortable speaking, why don't you just go out and speak, and then that'll give you the confidence eventually to write. So I've often laughed that this whole life of doing this was actually in substitute for the idea of writing. And the other book I've written too now, the one about Swami Kriyananda, came about also because he told me very early in my life that he thought it would be a good idea for me if I thought about writing about him. So I've always known that I was going to do it, but it was a big effort for me to understand the process of writing, even though I have an inclination for it and apparently a natural talent for it. In some incarnation, I got scrambled up in my head about what it was, and I wasn't able to do it. So I wrote that one book, which Swamiji never considered to be the only book I would write, but I didn't do anything else for many years. And I was saying to some this morning, I think he just grew impatient. So he just handed me this assignment. He also understands the writing of this book is going to be a story in the next book I write about Swami, because he understands psychology very well, and he knew that in a strange way, even though it's a very serious book, I didn't take it that seriously. Because it wasn't about Swamiji, and that sort of, to me, is my serious assignment. This was like a side assignment. So when he gave it to me to work on, I had no choice. I had to work on it. I couldn't just not do it. But I also sort of felt like, what difference does it make? And that lack of self-importance about the project allowed me to just work with it in a casual way, which for me turned out to be the opportunity to, on some more subtle level, just understand what it means to write. I just understood writing, whereas before I'd always thought it was some obscure reality. So the first miracle of this book was that I wrote it at all. The stories are all from other people, but with the exception of one, all the way they're all told is my writing. I would interview people and they would give me a story, and then I would turn it into something. Often they would just tell me a long life experience, and I would essentially find the story in what they told me, because most people don't think in terms of plot. You have to think in terms of plot when you're doing this. I shared with some of you earlier, and I want to talk about it now. There were two miracles in my own life in writing this book. The first was somehow a lifelong misunderstanding about what writing is, just got lifted, and I just got. And ever since this, I've just been able to write anything I feel like writing without any of the issues I had before. When I was working on the book about Swami Kriyananda and really struggling to write it, I was talking to Swamiji, and he said, just casually, I've never had writer's block, ever, not once. I thought, my Lord, just because he's so surrendered to a higher power, he just asks Master what he's supposed to do, and it just comes out. I mean, there's an answer right there about how we are creative anyways, that we don't think about being creative in our own selves, but just allow it to flow through us. But the second miracle of this book, as far as I'm concerned, is the profound effect it had on me to talk to people about their experiences with God. It was not dissimilar to the experience I had about Swamiji, writing about Swami, but it was also subtly different. The process I used to write this book is that I sent out messages to everywhere as far as I could, onto Facebook and through all the Ananda systems that I knew about. And I just told people I had to do this book, and could they help me? And then I went to a few of the Ananda communities and made personal appointments with people. I also talked on the phone and sometimes on Skype, but it was the personal ones that really touched me. Especially, I spent 12 days at Ananda Village, and I spent 12 hours a day for 12 days, just listening to people talk to me about their own relationship with God and how that relationship had been proved to them, often in multiple ways. And when I was explaining this earlier to some of you, I mentioned that I can type very quickly without looking at my fingers, so I was able to just hold my laptop on my lap and not break eye contact with people. Now, we are, even within the realm of the Ananda communities, we are a wide variety of people. Some of us are dynamic and the kind of people who would have been successful in no matter what they did. Some of us have been through very hard times, either within the community or before we came, or interludes where we wandered away from the spiritual path and had to have life beat us around quite a lot and then crawl back. Some people are very shy, can barely articulate what they're feeling, and you get more. I mean, I would type it down verbatim, and sometimes it would, there would just hardly be a coherent sentence. And so it was, and then that's not really a sentence, but a lot communicates if you're sitting there. But every single person, no matter what their context, what happened to me is I had the actual experience of the fact that God loves every one of us. And his love is not based on any of the criteria that we use for one another. And even the best of us, we notice things. We notice whether someone looks healthy or unhealthy, whether they look kind or not, whether they look happy, whether they look desperate. Someone once remarked, even we always notice the gender. Someone's gender is the first thing you notice and the last thing you forget. To just even know whether you're dealing with a man or woman. We have so many ways in which the pure contact of spirit to spirit is modified and modified and conditioned and conditioned. And there's also an inner sense that's very hard to shake, that somehow we have to earn God's love, and that he parcels it out to us in a way not dissimilar to the way we parcel it out to other people. That if we're good, he especially likes us. And if we're highly successful, he likes us even more. And if we are chronically prone to self-evidently self-destructive or materialistic or wrong thoughts from the point of view of what's in our own best interest, that he therefore begins to withdraw his affection from us. And even if one can speak against that myth, there's still a deep part within us that holds to it. And in fact, Devi said once, when for a period of time, Devi was teaching our yoga training course. It was like a 3-month course, and it was at Ananda village. This was many years ago. And she said something very interesting. She said everybody who came to take that class was an angel because of their sincere desire to devote that much time in their life, that much money, that much effort to a purely spiritual pursuit. Every person who came already had a high level of devotion to higher truth. And she said she thought at first that her job in that class was to make sure she got the information across. And she had the curriculum, and we're going to teach about this aspect of Raja Yoga, and here's the yamas and the niyamas, and here's about the chakras, and here's this, and this they have to learn. But she said after doing that course a few times, she realized that the only purpose, the only objective she actually had was to help people understand that God loved them just the way they were. Because once that was understood, she said everything else they needed to know would follow after that. And as long as that was not understood, it really didn't matter how many facts and figures and Sanskrit words you could say, because we were then prey to what Patanjali calls missing the point, where you can be very serious on the spiritual path and still miss the point. And I felt that the writing of this book for me was a very special gift for me to go very deeply into that one fact. And what was so touching to me also was that it was not an abstraction. I think that's why it touched me. I can say it as an abstraction, but when you see someone sitting in front of you who's just, in some cases, just telling you about horrific life experiences and one failure after another, after another, after another, and then still the eyes are just bright and shining, because at the end of it, the result of all that experience was, in one way or another, God just reached right into their heart and helped them to know, well, that's where the title of the book came, that we are loved, and that God is also protecting us in the sense that we can't be lost. No matter how far we transgress, we are never lost. He's always protecting us from final loss. He's not protecting us from bankruptcy. He's not protecting us from death. But why should he? These things don't matter. There was a story, I think it was about Adi Shankaracharya, where one of his disciples, this woman, was very anxious about everything, and she kept expressing her anxieties to her guru, and he kept trying to get her not to be so anxious, and finally she said, well, what if I die? And he turned to her, he said, die then. And she fell over dead. Just right then, boom, she just died. It was like, okay, you're so afraid of this, well, experience it then. That we have all these different ways that we relate to this world, but the divine is always in there with us. Now, in another way, just talking about the importance of this book, quite apart from my role in it, which is entirely incidental, and as far as I'm concerned, has long since been fulfilled. When I first came to India in 1986 and was leading the first pilgrimage tour that I was leading, I was leading a pilgrimage on my first trip to India. I'd never seen India, and I was leading a pilgrimage, but I would get the guide to explain things to me, and then I would turn around and explain them to the group. And we managed to fake it pretty nicely. We all had a lot of fun together. I'd traveled, but only in Europe. I'd never traveled in India or in any Asian country or Africa. And I remember looking out the window and just understanding the concept of overpopulation, which had never been anything but just a theory to me, just seeing how many people there were and what a strain that put on every system, because there were just so many people. And you could see where we were traveling that some people were struggling, some people were well-to-do. There was just all of these issues happening right outside the bus. I mean, traveling in an air-conditioned bus is such a strange experience, because you're really in another reality. It's like visiting from another planet. You go in the air-conditioned bus and you look out the window. But I became aware of the fact, I've not been a political activist in the traditional sense for many, many years. I actually consider myself to be extremely politically active, and I'll explain that in just a moment. But I knew looking out the window, because I'm educated enough to know that there are sufficient resources in the world, there's sufficient wealth, there's plenty of water, there's plenty of food. It's not as if we couldn't create a completely different world than the one we live in. The reason we don't is because we don't want to. And I don't mean individually we don't want to, but collectively, the consciousness is just not there. People's consciousness is on many different levels. We're learning many different lessons. And so here we are. We all just have to live out the level, the vibration that's the right vibration for us. And as much as we want to rail against certain conditions, they won't be shifted until the whole consciousness of the planet is different. Truly, they won't really be shifted until we rise into another yuga. But even as that process takes place, it's all about consciousness, 100%. It's all about consciousness. And I realized just looking out the window that the only way to uplift anything or anyone is to change consciousness. And I became even more committed at that point to the life I was already living, which is to dedicate myself to helping people change consciousness. Because once consciousness changes, we just see this world in a completely different manner. And even though, even in America, I'm not registered to vote, and I occasionally vote, and I must confess, the few times I have voted, I voted against someone. I've seen someone so terrible that I thought we can't. Even among politicians, sometimes someone will stand out, and I have to vote against them, but rarely. But I feel that I am intensely politically active because I'm working at the cause. I'm working to solve the cause. And the cause of difficulty is not merely the collective consciousness. As I was saying last night, this planet is not meant to be a heaven on earth. It just isn't. This planet is a university, and in a university you have all kinds of classes. You can't run a university with just the top level seminars. You have to run it with all of the classes that have to happen. And so many people enter this particular university and they're in what many of us would look like the remedial classes. They're learning being a human being number 101 and are just kind of trying to get the basics down. So on one hand, we have the issue of selfishness and self-centeredness, which I don't know how we can ever shift that. But we have also something much more serious going on, which is the increasing worship of ego as the central cause of everything. And it's not as bad in this country, but it's still going on in America strongly, that people, even when they try to solve problems, they're trying to solve problems with their own personal egoic will and their own personal egoic skill, and thinking that even we can collectively get enough egos to agree on something. And every so often you see these sort of movements come through where everybody wants to we're all going to affirm, we're all going to do some little exercise or another, but the whole idea of it is that the source and the guiding force of this reality is just our opinions. And that is even more detrimental than anything else, because how can the ego itself appraise itself? How can we even imagine for a moment that just we little human beings are just in charge of this? I mean, that's a super depressing thought, like super, super depressing. A friend of mine who's a mathematician, and I've never been inclined much either to math or science. I made the grades I needed to make, but the world view, it never clicked with me. So I was very interested when he was talking to me about the fact that before he began to seriously study mathematics, he was an atheist, he said. But when he got really serious into mathematics, he discovered that in mathematics, if the answer is not, as he put it, harmonious and beautiful, it's not the actual answer. Because the nature of mathematics, when you get past arithmetic, is that it's all these extraordinary patterns that are inherent in creation. And when you really start studying those patterns, they become harmonious and beautiful. And as a mathematician, he began to understand that if the answer he had come up with was not harmonious and beautiful, then he hadn't yet solved the question, hadn't yet answered the equation. And he began to realize, if that's true in such a limited field as mathematics, he said it must be true in all of creation. And so it actually turned him to God, because the idea that this world is just run by individual egos is neither harmonious nor beautiful. And so it crossed his mind it had to be the wrong answer. And so what we're looking for as devotees, and how we're trying to serve as devotees, is not merely to turn people into good people. I mean, it's better to be a good person than not to be a good person. And in this way, the story of Swami Kriyananda and his own father, and Master's comments about his own father, is actually rather touching, because Swami writes about his father as being a good man, even a noble man, an honorable man in many, many ways, but he was not pious. He did not believe in God. And Master's comment about him was, the road to Hades is paved with good intentions. I mean, that's not to say that he was a bad man in any way, but it's not enough. It's not enough merely to be honorable. If we're really going to fulfill the purpose for which we are born, it's the whole spiritual path is about transcending the ego. And unless and until, as individuals and in a larger way, we all begin to attune ourselves to a higher reality, we're never going to find what we're looking for, and we're never going to be able to create, even in a small sense, the harmony that we're looking for. There's some very interesting characteristics about Ananda. And I was remembering, two friends have told me essentially the same story. I'll start with one of them. A woman friend, when she actually came to Ananda through our temple in Palo Alto, where I live. And when she arrived, she is still, but when she arrived, she was in the midst of an extremely successful business career. She was a very strong, outgoing person, just really knew how to focus on what she wanted and make it happen in a very successful way. So she arrived, in our temple, and she looked around, and she began, as I joked to her later, she began to work the room. She was just going around making friends, making contacts, just sort of doing everything that she'd always done that had always worked so well for her. As she described it later, she said it was as if she was transparent glass, and to whatever extent she was opaque, she was Teflon, as she put it. Anything that any connection just rolled right off of her. And she was very drawn to our teaching, and was bewildered, but was too drawn to Master and to the teaching to let that deflect her. So she went on this way for a number of weeks, just completely not understanding why she couldn't make any connection with anyone, seemingly. Finally, she just completely gave up, and as she put it, she started concentrating on the masters. And when she would come into the temple, she would try to attune herself with their consciousness instead of all of this effort to make friends around her, which, heavens, to make friends around you is a perfectly positive thing to do. She said as soon as she shifted her attention from the people around her to the masters, she said almost immediately people started relating to her. And she wasn't really even trying anymore. But all of a sudden she was on the vibration, people could see her. They just couldn't see her before, but then they could see her. Another man told me, less dramatically, but exactly the same story. He kept trying to make friends. He couldn't make any friends. He finally gave up, started devoting himself to meditation and to attunement with Master, and then all of a sudden friends started coming to him in the context of Ananda. Even in all of our communities, people would always ask us questions, like, what do you do when you don't get along? How do you solve arguments? How do you settle disagreements? And it sounds a little fantasy-like to say, well, it rarely comes up. We just don't have those kind of disagreements. I don't mean that people always get along. Occasionally people have karmic conflicts and people have personality things to work out. But it almost never, I dare say never, has risen to the level of an actual crisis in the community. And it is not because we have any elaborate systems for getting along. In fact, we have no systems at all. In all these years, we've never had to make them. We don't have any grievance committees. We don't have any, resolution of disharmony committees. We don't have any systems, nothing, zero. And if we ever needed them, we would have. But we have one system that just keeps working all the time, that everyone's primary relationship is with God, and from that attunement, as I'm saying, all the other relationships build. And even if there's dissonance, with each other, it's resolved first by trying to come to some kind of an understanding of what the divine is trying to show me through this experience. And then even if we re-enter it on the level of just trying to work it out with one another, the thought is always, what does God want? How can I serve God in this? How can I be an instrument of God? And a prayer to the divine to help make it work. In this, before I finish that thought, in this context, a number of years ago, a reporter came to do a story on Ananda, and Ananda village at that point. And it's a bustling little community, and he came out, and I brought him over to Swami Kriyananda's house for lunch. And they were talking. He was just an ordinary reporter from the local paper. He didn't have any particular insight. And he admitted that he was a little disappointed when he finally came out to visit our community, because we just looked so ordinary. He was really hoping his story would have been better, if we were walking around in strange costumes doing strange things. That makes much better press, absolutely. So he sort of didn't know where his story was going to come from. And he said to Swamiji, you all seem just like everyone else in the county. And Swamiji responded, yes, he said, we are just like everyone else, except that we put God first. And the reporter kind of blinked and had honestly no idea what had just been said to him, because he didn't have any idea what that even meant. The word God is a very unspecific word to begin with, but he just had no idea what it meant to put God first. But that is an extraordinary revolution, because on this planet everybody puts ego first. And when you really put God first and try to really live your life according to divine principles with the understanding that I am never alone, and this is what brings me back to the beginning of what this book is about. This book is about people who took the trouble to ask. I had a very vivid experience of this many years ago, 1979. Swami Kriyananda was living for a time in San Francisco. He was launching an urban center that we had there for about 10 years. We ended up renting this huge 5-story house, 45 rooms, we always live in the best neighborhoods. This very, very expensive neighborhood in San Francisco, and whole crowd of people lived in that house as an ashram for a decade. And in the course of that time, he was living in a little apartment, and I was there for a few months of that project. And he wanted to make a recording of himself chanting. That tape, I think, has been superseded by better ones. And I have neither technical ability nor a very good musical ear, so it only tells you that there was nobody better, is all I can say, that I became his recording engineer, which was ludicrous. It's the only word for it. But the system was simple enough. We were just running a reel-to-reel tape and one microphone, and there wasn't a whole lot to set up. But I managed still to make a mess a lot of times of the little bit that I had to work with. And he was giving a lot of classes, and then after he finished the classes, sometimes we'd go back to his apartment, and then he would just do this solo chanting, and I would run the machine so we could get it on tape. And the classes he was giving at the time were classes in a system he called superconscious living, how to attune ourselves. It's a great cohesive system. He's done so many things that we can't keep up. That one has sort of been lost, but someday it'll come forward again. So he was teaching classes in superconscious living, and one night we were working on this recording, and I could not, for anything in the world, I could not get the sound to come out on the tape. Fortunately, I was aware enough to know that it wasn't recording. And I said, "Sir, we can't record now. I've got to figure this out." So I figured the thing out. I telephoned people. I'm turning the pages of the instruction manual. Swamiji goes off and meditates for a little while. He comes back. He said, "Can we record now?" "Not yet, sir. I can't make it work." And he goes and maybe had a little bit of supper, and then he comes back, and "No, I can't make it work yet." And finally I just said, "Divine Mother, if you want this recording to happen, you've got to help me." And then I just undid every single connection, every connection that there was, and then I reconnected it exactly the same. I didn't change anything, and it worked perfectly. And then he recorded, for an hour or two. It was just blissful. It was called Music for Meditation. It might still be floating around somewhere. Then the next night, Swami's giving this big program in front of a whole lot of people, and just without any warning, he says, "Asha has something to say." And so I said, "Sure," because when he says something, I always say yes first, and then I try to figure it out. "Okay." And then I stood there with the microphone in my hand, and I said, "What?" And he said, "Tell them about what happened last night with the recording." Because when he asked me how did I make it work, I told him exactly what I did. So I explained it just like I said, and in the context of superconscious living, what he was trying to tell us was to attune yourself to a higher reality. And my testimonial was, these are very powerful teachings. They will absolutely work. They will solve every problem in your life. If you remember to use them. Which was to my own embarrassment. It had taken me almost 2 hours to remember to use them. And so this particular book, if it has any enduring effect on anyone, which I pray with all my heart that it does. As I said, I feel like its purpose, as far as I'm concerned, has already been fulfilled. But if it helps others, that would be a huge bonus, and I would be grateful for that. This is just one story after another about people's lives, about things that happen to them, and how, in the critical moment, if you call on God, if you call on Divine Mother, everything can change. Just literally, in an instant, everything can change from the way things were to a completely different way of being. Some of the stories are just like that. You're standing in one place, you're about to be killed, and instead of being killed, you're over there. And no time has passed in between, no physical space has been crossed. It was just not my time to go, so I'm standing over there. Or sometimes it's very tiny, just little tiny events. But sometimes, as Swamiji said, it's not even the life-saving moments that are really so powerful to us, because it's almost like, well, God needs you to stay around and do more work for Him. But sometimes it's the little ones that hardly matter, that are much more a sign and telling us on this level also, that if you have a dear friend in your life, a woman friend of mine once told me about her vacation trip in such detail that she described the wallpaper in the bathroom of the hotel room she was staying in, right? And I was genuinely interested for only one reason. It was because it mattered to her. It mattered to her, and it was her way of sharing the joy of the experience with me. And so I was perfectly happy to hear it. Think about how we all listen to our children talk on. I go exercise at the YMCA near where I live, and it's a place where many parents come with their children. It's one of the reasons I like it as a health club. It's not a place where people are showing off. It's very family oriented. This woman came in with a little girl. The little girl was about 5 or 6 years old. I saw them come into the lobby. The girl was talking, just talking. And she wasn't just babbling. She had important ideas that she needed to tell her mother, at least important from her point of view. She talked all the way through the lobby. She talked all the way in the dressing room. She talked all the way to the swimming pool. The only time she stopped talking is when she was actually underwater. And then as soon as she would come up, she would start again. And the mother was between charmed and absolutely going out of her mind with this child. And I looked at that child and I thought, wow, that must have been me. And I sort of took the mother aside and put my arm around her and said, it worked out okay for me. It'll probably work out okay for her. I said, I've made a career out of it. It's really all right. You know? But the mother, listened, accepted. Sometimes, it might have taken a little discipline on her part. But this is her child. Everything that's important to this child is important to her. Everything in this world is a symbol of a higher reality. That's an extremely important point to realize. We think it's all an end in itself. It's not. It's all to teach us about something greater. Even the physical sun, as Master points out, is a symbol of the spiritual eye. And when you think of the physical sun that way, think how big it is. Think how powerful it is. Think how absolutely life-sustaining the sun is. Everything in the world, in this planet, depends on the sun. And we're so thrilled when the sun comes up. And it's so beautiful sometimes when the sun comes down. Isn't that true? And it's a symbol of the true light, which is not the sun at all, but is the inner light. And in this way, this is one of the ways in which we experience God through His creation, and how we make the creation for us a spiritual experience. It's not that we worship nature or see nature in any way as a God in itself, but it symbolizes to us everything that is the divine behind it. So all of our relationships, our human relationships, especially those relationships which pull at our hearts and bring us into a more of our own feeling nature, are not really there just on our own terms. We think, oh, I'm a mother, I must take care of my children, I'm a child, I must be dutiful to my parents, I'm a wife, I'm a husband. All of these things, they're not in any of them an end in themselves. They're a way for us to experience in our own selves a higher truth. And the more profoundly we use those to learn a higher truth, the more we are utilizing our incarnation the way God intended it for us. And it's very important for us to meditate on the purest expression of these relationships that we can imagine. I mean, some of us are gifted to have mothers who are nearly divine, fathers who are infinitely wise, husbands or wives who behave toward us like a divine beloved. But not always. It's just not always the karma. We may not have that in our lives at all. But even the absence of it, in a very interesting way, awakens in us an understanding of what it should be. Sometimes when you don't have it, that contrast tells us what it would be like. The classical bhavs, the way we experience God, father, mother, friend, beloved, master, and even God as our own child. which in India is much more widely understood, but it's also just a beautiful bhav to contemplate. At Christmas time, the celebration is of Jesus as a little baby. And I've had to think about that a lot, because we think of God, we want to think of God as powerful. And the last thing that you think of is in a baby, because a baby is helpless by his very nature. But the whole Christmas story is about the little babe in the manger. But the reality of it is, and all of us know this, babies draw from us this spontaneous affection, don't they? And this spontaneous, just absolute willingness to give. My friend who had 2 sons, he said, I thought I was a pretty selfless guy, he said, until my 2 sons were born. He said, and then I realized that selfless means no self. Not merely generous, it means zero. You cease to exist in the necessity to give to these children. And he also jokingly said that he swore before he became a father that he would never participate in what he considered disgusting displays of affection that he saw all the fathers doing with their children. And as soon as his babies were born, he said you would just do anything to elicit out of them that little smile. And he threw all dignity to the winds, in his relationship with his own sons. But the freedom of that's what loving God as a baby is about, is because we become utterly selfless. And there's nothing in us that is thinking about what I'm going to get from this. And it's completely effortless and spontaneous. And that's why we have this experience of having children, is because we find out that love is no effort. Love is absolutely who I am, and there's nothing I can do to prevent myself from loving. And that's how we should love God. Whether we visualize God as little Gopala or not, what's trying to come out of us is that relationship. And here's the other side of it. We never stop to think whether that baby wants our love. We have to love the baby. He'll die if we don't love him. But also we never stop and think, oh, maybe he's busy today. Maybe I really shouldn't go into his room. He might be doing something and I might interrupt him. Maybe he's tired of my just bringing him juice all the time. A woman friend of mine, she raised 4 children, and this was the 4th child. And we don't have as much household help in America. The baby woke up crying, and she was so tired. She went to try to help the baby, and what she usually did was give him a bottle of juice, and then he would drink the juice, and that would content him in the middle of the night. He was past nursing. And she went, and she handed him the bottle of juice, but when she handed him the bottle of juice, he just began to scream. And she just was so tired, she just staggered back to her bedroom, and she said to her husband, you go figure it out. And he went in, and the bed was totally soaked, and the baby was soaked. It had turned out that she hadn't put the top on the jar. She just handed him the bottle of juice, and what she actually did was just turned it over on top of him. Here's the little baby, here's mommy coming to help me, and instead she just turns orange juice all over him like this. Just, these things happen, But the next morning he loved her just as much. Never crossed the baby's mind that he shouldn't love his mother back. This is why we talk about this, in a divine way. Here's a story also about God's love for us and our love for God. As you all know, Master lived most of his life in America, and he only came back to India for 1.5 years in 1935. When he came back, of course, he visited his family home in Calcutta at 4 Garpar Road. Many of you may have gone there, and Master describes in his autobiography the small attic room where he said he first had the vision of the divine. And you can go, if you make arrangements with the Ghosh family that still lives there, you can go and sit in the attic room. It's very touching. When we first started coming to India in 1986, Hari Krishna Ghosh, who was actually the nephew of Yogananda, the son of Yogananda's brother Sananda. Hare Krishna Ghosh was elderly and retired, but still living, and he would himself host everyone who came to see, and he would tell stories. He was 15 years old in 1935 when Master came to visit, and Hare Krishna became very attached to him, and so he has many stories, which Hare Krishna's son now tells us, because Hare Krishna's gone. Well, after we'd been coming for a few years, we met Hare Krishna's younger sister. Her name was Shefli. She's also in the astral world, or off the planet now. Shefli didn't speak much English and was very shy, so this story came through Hare Krishna. Shefli doesn't have any memory of this, but this is the story that's told of her. When Master came in 1935, she was 3 years old. And 3 years old is enough to be a full functioning person, but not enough to have a very sophisticated sense of the world around you. You know, it's a charming age because children are just so free and open-hearted. Apparently, something about Master, which is not hard to discern, just absolutely entranced her. And whenever he would come into the house, she would rush to him, she would hold onto his leg, she would lean onto his lap, she would climb onto his lap. She just insisted on being wherever he was. And one of the family stories they tell is, I guess they were going out to a movie theater, and little children are not allowed, but Master picked her up and put her on his chest and buttoned his coat over her, and apparently took her to the movies. You know, and so she just rested against his heart. And she, of course, feels herself to be a disciple of Master. That's how she lived her life. And her only contact with her guru was when she was 3 years old. Now, being a rather intellectual person, my first thought was, what a waste. But then I thought, no, I don't think so. Because how many of us, even in the presence of our guru, would have the complete lack of self-consciousness that would allow us just to live out what was in our heart without it ever crossing our mind that wasn't what we ought to do. Just the absolute certainty that we love God and God loves us. I love the Master and the Master loves me. I want to be with him, and of course he wants to be with me. Yes, more subtle understandings are also helpful, but in the life of Jesus Christ, there is that part where all the mothers were bringing their children to him for blessings, and the children themselves were rushing to see him, and the disciples were trying to get the children to go away, thinking that they were annoying the Master. And the Master rebuked his disciples and said, "Suffer little children to come unto me, for of such is the kingdom of heaven." And he didn't mean the lack of sophisticated understanding. He meant that complete assumption that I belong here and that I am loved. And that's what the Masters want from us. That's what God and Guru want from us. That's what Divine Mother wants from us. She's like a mother. She's there all the time, just waiting to give this to us. And what blocks us is our own inability to receive it. I was thinking also, another very famous story in the life of Jesus is the story of, it was Mary Magdalene, most probably. Jesus was having dinner with his disciples, and the habit of the times was that the men were in one room and the women were in another. But this disciple of his, Mary Magdalene, who was the reformed prostitute that he'd saved, she was really a courtesan, would be more accurate. She was not a low-class person, but she definitely lived outside the norms of society. And Jesus brought her into the fold, and partly because she already lived outside the norms of society, she had a certain freedom in her relationship with him that more confined, people who are more confined by the customs of society didn't feel free to express. And Jesus always received her in the spirit in which she brought herself to him, despite the tut of the many disciples around him. And on this occasion, he was having dinner, and the woman came in, knelt at his feet, had a basin of water, washed his feet, and then washed his feet with her hair. That's how the story is told. And then broke over his feet an expensive bottle of salve, ointment, perfume. And that was the scene in which Judas criticized, because he saw all this to be a waste. That was a very expensive bottle of perfume. You could have sold that and given it to the poor. And in the Bible it says not that he cared about the poor. What he cared about was money. But Jesus said, the poor you have always with me. I am only with you for a time. And he allowed her to do it. And you hear that and you read it in the Bible, but I like to translate these things into a real situation. Let's say we're all having dinner with Swamiji somewhere, and somebody bursts into the room with a basin of water and kneels down at his feet and washes his feet with her hair. I mean, how many of us would be really comfortable with that? Wouldn't the inclination to be just like the other disciples? Well, that's really too much. Is that really necessary? But he saw it. Jesus saw it exactly for what it was. Just this love that was so extravagant, because she was absolutely certain. She was just certain, both of her heart and his, to the point that literally there was no other reality. And that's why that story lives on and has so much power in the Bible, and how Jesus allowed it and chastised those who criticized her. That's the confidence that we're trying to build within ourselves. No one can give that to us. That's not philosophy. That doesn't come from ideas. That comes from actual experience. And that actual experience comes when we seek that experience. If we never ask for God's help, even if he wanted to help us, he can't break his own laws. If we're just determined that our ego is the one in charge and we're not going to trouble him with this, we're just going to do it all ourselves, we're the only ones who suffer. He just waits patiently. I had an interesting experience in a seclusion that I had once. Much of the time in meditation, we think about self-offering. We're going to do our kriyas as an offering. We're going to, offer the fruits of our labors, whatever it might be we're offering. And I had this intuition when I was meditating that instead of concentrating on my outward moving energy, perhaps it would be beneficial to try to concentrate on God's incoming energy. And I tried to imagine myself as a child of Divine Mother, and I tried to receive that love from her. And I could feel that it could only come into a certain point. And what was blocking it was my own habit of holding on to all of these different points of view, much of them past life. I'm hurt about this, I'm angry about that, which I never would think of as directly about Divine Mother. But you see, to whatever extent we resist our life experiences, and to whatever extent we build ego definitions around those life experiences. This has happened to me, I'm suffering, they're suffering, it shouldn't be this way, why did it come like this, why? To that extent, we cut ourselves off from that flow. If your mother is doing for you exactly what needs to be done, and you're sitting there saying, no, it's not, it's wrong, it shouldn't be this way, then no matter how much she wants to love you, she can't. And I became poignantly aware of how it was I myself who was limiting my relationship. I tried to think of it as God's lack of interest in me, but it was really my own clinging to my separateness that kept us apart. And in writing these stories, I really began to just see in people's eyes, when we let go of that, either out of desperation or the threat of something happening, or just because we know that that's the truth, and just keep reaching out, then this entirely other universe opens up in front of us, and everything becomes just so sweet, just so completely different. A rabbi once wrote about the time when the Jews were persecuted in the Holocaust in Germany, which of course is a black mark on human history, no matter how you look at it. But he proposed something which very few Jews have embraced, that he said those years were the shining hour of the Jewish people. He said because it was our opportunity to prove the truth of what we always say, that there is only one reality, and that reality was God. He said absolutely everything else was taken from us. And so we had a chance to stand by the only thing we had left, which was our relationship with God. You know, we don't want to wait until the stakes are so high. We don't want to make God test us to that point. But if we do, He will. Because sooner or later, we have to really understand that nothing can break this relationship. Absolutely nothing can break it. And that's pretty much worth whatever it costs, if you think about it. I read about this man who was imprisoned. He might have been in Vietnam, I don't know, it doesn't matter. And he was subject to terrible torture. And he was a man of faith, but his faith was severely tested, but he kept trying to endure. And one day he said he didn't have anything left inside of himself, he said. And in a way that had never occurred to him before, he absolutely surrendered himself to God. And he said as soon as he did that, he said this bliss just came over him. And instead of all the resentment and anger that had always been in him against the people who he thought were hurting him, all of a sudden he felt nothing but compassion for them. And this man who just a second before had been inflicting pain upon him just looked at him, and then he walked away, and he said no one ever touched him again after that. You know, both the lesson had been learned, and also the vibration he was putting out made it impossible. You know, and he said himself, it was a hard teaching, but once it was learned, it was learned. You know, and we want to learn first before the hard teaching is required, but to always turn in that direction. This is the real truth of our lives, and this is what I was talking about it last night. This is entirely and only what Yogananda came to teach us, that Divine Mother is our very own and is nearer to us than our own hearts and our own thoughts. And nothing we do can ever separate ourselves from her. And the degree of our closeness is the degree of our openness. In the Bible it says about Jesus, to all who received him. And if this book has any message, it's just to say, look what happens when you do. And if we can take that to heart, then we will be beginning the start of a revolution, first for ourselves, and then for everyone whose lives we touch. So that would be what I would have to say.